Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Please take a moment to click the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon for us. That will help us uh, know how we're impacting people, and that hopefully will remind you of upcoming episodes.
So, if you're new to this channel, each week Todd and I take a moment to talk about the upcoming weekend's lectionary reading from the Gospels. And our goal is to talk about those readings in the context of love, compassion, and social justice. And our hope is that our talking will be just talking, as in justice, but that also something we say during this conversation would inspire you, along with us, to do more than just talking. So, Todd, what are we looking at this week?
I'm pleased to say that we are in Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through chapter 3, verse 6.
I
Praise the
cannot put
Lord.
into words how happy I am to be in the Gospel of Mark. I don't know which one of the synoptics is my favorite out of them, but I love them so much. I just dropped a clip. Maybe you heard that, but I'm so happy. I love them so much. I am so happy to be back in the synoptics.
Yes.
So this is a pretty interesting passage. Um, it's the section right here in the beginning of Mark that talks about Jesus and his relationship to the Sabbath. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's interesting that if this subject comes up so early in Mark's writing, that they come to this issue and put three stories back to back about it,
Mm-hmm.
um, to address it. So it clearly needed to be addressed for the community that Mark was written in, and it's very very interesting how that comes about so quickly.
And I love my favorite lens through which to look at the Sabbath is in labor justice or social justice through that lens.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I see happening here, that being pointed to here in the beginning. It's they're passing through the grain field, and they do something that, in my estimation, wouldn't be considered labor. You know what I mean? And I think it's a
Right.
misunderstanding of what the Sabbath's intention was to begin with. But anyway, I find it fascinating that in the story, Jesus's defense is another illegal action where to follow the teachings of the law would have been death dealing, and to not follow it would have been life giving. Like there's a situationalness to it here, where it's the story of David and his companions and how they went in and ate the consecrated bread out of the temple because they were on the point of starvation. And no
Mm-hmm.
one was supposed to eat that but the priest, but they were starving. And so what do? Do you stick to the law in those instances and say, well, we gotta, the law comes first, the law's the highest priority, I don't care if there's starving people? Or do we, say, what's the most life-giving action in this specific situation, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's the letter of the law or not? And some people do it that way. Some people answer it with letter of the law versus spirit of the law, that when the spirit contradicts the letter, you go with the spirit. But outside of that, I mean, I don't think that goes far enough, at least for me. I just look at what's life giving and what's death dealing. And if applying something in this context is more death dealing than life giving, then it doesn't matter how law commanded it is. Then you do what's the most life giving.
Mm-hmm.
I love that balance here. I love that that kind of litmus test for what fidelity to the God of the Torah here is. Yes, This may be exactly what the Torah commanded against, but in this situation, it's the most life-giving thing to do. And so that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, I've heard so many times, both both people talking about disobedience in the context of civil laws and how you're don't be a lawbreaker, be a law keeper, and that there's something fundamentally wrong with you when you break the civil law. And I've heard the same thing said when it's come to religious law or biblical interpretation, where people have said, well, but the Bible says, which what they mean is saying, my understanding of the Bible is, and therefore, because this is what I understand we're supposed to do, or it seems very clear that this is what we're supposed to do, I am going to stand by that position, even though it's going to harm people around me. It's going to perpetuate systems of inequity and injustice. I I am going to stay on the side of law keeper, or I've heard people say sola scriptura, uh, for in order, because that's a higher priority. And to me, my reading of how what matters to God is that I'm more faithful to the Bible than I am to people. And because of that, I will let people
People can
suffer.
be sacrificed.
That's right. I've heard people suggest that I will always be on the side of Israel, because Israel is the covenant people of God, and so they will choose to not find a problem with how the current state of Israel, which is just historically, by the way, not the covenant people of God, but that's not that's it's a political state that is not tied to God's historic covenant with Jewish people. Anyway, they have said, I will, because we're always supposed to be pro Israel. That means I will turn a blind eye to what this current political state named Israel is doing to people in Gaza. So it is, this is what you said is, this is a great example, and Jesus brings out a powerful example. He says David went in to the holy place and took something that was set aside only for certain people to eat, and he and his compatriots, and this is David prior to being king of Israel. This is
Warrior David.
This is warrior David. These are ragamuffin band of exiles, uh, enemies of the state, sneaking into the tabernacle to grab the consecrated bread and eat it. And Jesus said, they were starving, so that's, and I think he would have said, if there were starving people, other people not named David, who were starving, it would have been okay for them to go in and eat the consecrated bread in that situation, because somebody's hunger is more important to address than keeping
Ritual
this
purity.
ritual purity.
Yeah. Yeah. So in my mind too, and I was thinking about this week as I was leading up, as we were preparing for this, there's an axis as well. And on one of those, well, let's say the x-axis is uh, lawful versus unlawful, right? And you have this spectrum. But the y-axis there is life-giving versus death-dealing, right? And some people focus just on the one, and they want to be lawful versus unlawful, even when it's death dealing. But the axis that Jesus is prioritizing here, or that at least the Gospel of Mark is prioritizing, is the life-giving axis versus the death-dealing axis. And sometimes it's unlawful to do what's most life-giving. Sometimes and the original intent of the law is life-giving, right? I don't want to disparage the law in this at all.
Right.
The original intent of the law was to be life-giving, but no law can foresee all situations and areas of application. And so
That's right.
there's this continuum, there's this axis, these two poles of lawful, unlawful, and some people, again, they live just on that.
Yeah, they only see a horizontal line.
Right, and so they're going to always be on the lawful side, but that has to be balanced out by the vertical line of life giving versus death dealing, and we need to live in this we just need to live in this half. Whatever
Right.
is the most life giving. Sometimes it's going to be lawful, sometimes it's not, but the priority is to be a source of life and liberty and justice and compassion and love.
Yeah, I think that's so important to mention about that axis, because what we see, uh, certain sectors of Christianity, I think specifically of Calvinists, is that they live only on the axis, the horizontal axis, and they explain and justify everything that happens on the x-axis as it only matter. It is ultimately the decision is, the decisions to do the lawful thing always means that it will ultimately be life-giving
Right.
in the ever after, or the beyond, or even, to be probably more accurate, as they say, Jesus Jesus did what was most life-giving by fulfilling the law completely, and therefore we have, because he perfectly fulfilled the law. That was all that mattered for when you're looking at Jesus as the perfect substitution. In that atonement theory, is that he perfectly carried out the law. And they would say, for us as faithful Christians, we are most faithful when we are living according to the law. Not whether or not we're showing grace and compassion and mercy. All those things fall very secondary to being, those are nice additions to being faithful to the law. And it appears that for Jesus, it is about being life-giving, and if that goes along with the law, being faithful to the law is a good secondary component. You're not antinomian just for the sake of being antinomian, but
Right.
but your priority is always, is this life-giving to humanity, whether it's yourself, whether it's your brother, whether it's the foreigner within your gates, whether it's somebody different from you, whether whoever it is, that it's ultimately life-giving to humanity and to all of creation.
And moralists call that vertical axis an axis of good versus evil. That you know that cuts the lawful versus unlawful. But and this is just to help people flesh out if this is a new thought for you. I find it much more realist rather than moralist to not call that vertical axis good versus evil, because good versus evil can become so um co-opted that those definitions can become they're just vulnerable to
Yeah,
being
it's subject to a very your interpretive lens, how you
right.
define good versus evil.
But if we call it life-giving, and that's what we mean by good, is life-giving and death dealing, then we're listening to communities, especially marginalized communities, and we're saying, what is it that's most life-giving for you, and among the options that are on the table, and
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 life
and moving
giving
in
just
that direction.
also being, meaning this life, meaning
Yeah,
giving life into this current material world in which we live now. This
correct.
is
It's
current
material
life
concrete.
giving.
Yes.
It is a material, concrete, life giving context now. We're addressing now. We're not talking about the by and by, pie in the sky.
Right, right. And so this first section wraps up with a statement from Jesus saying that the Son of Man is sovereign even of the Sabbath, that the Sabbath was made for humanity. and not humanity for the Sabbath. And I want to talk about that a little bit too, that the Sabbath, even in the Torah, the Sabbath was a labor justice thing. If you go back and read Exodus 28 through 11, that commandment is aimed at employers and masters and slave owners, that they
That's
not
right.
make the people that serve them work 7 days a week, that they give them time off. And I think about historically the accomplishments of labor movements and labor unions and the 8-hour workday. And even here in the United States, 1940 was the year that the Fair Labor Standards Act was established. That's honestly 1940s. That's still pretty recent. That's not even been 100 years yet. And that's what established even something that we take so much for granted now, which is the 40-hour work week that gives us not one day off, but two, in our weekly schedule, the way that we count time. But so we're moving even further than the Sabbath did and giving people 2 days off rather than just one, right? But the Sabbath at least was a start. These were well, yeah, it was a start. It was a step on that trajectory. But these are labor justice issues, and then tying it to the Son of Man. That phrase comes out of Daniel 7, where the Son of Man was this figure that was to liberate the people from oppressive, violent, unjust imperial powers, empires, right? And so to connect Sabbath with liberation from injustice, oppression, and violence on an imperial level as well as societal, I love the way that this chapter in Mark just weaves all of this in. It's a throwback to the Sabbath was made for humanity. Humanity is the priority here. Once again, that's our life-giving thing that we were talking about. Humanity is the priority here. That Sabbath serves that purpose, not the other way around. And again, this is that continuum of Sabbath would be on the law, axis, and humanity. What's life given to humanity? That's the vertical axis, and then tying it into the liberation of Daniel 7, that apocalyptic, liberation that was the hope of so many of Mark's community living under Roman oppression. That all of that. I love that section here. That here's this balancing act, and I think this is important because earlier in Mark chapter 2, I think it's Mark chapter 2. It might be Mark chapter 1, but already here, even though we're just 2 chapters into Mark, I think it's Mark chapter 1, where Jesus goes and heals Peter's mother. They go to Peter's mother's house and heals Peter's mother, and the story actually says that everybody else in town waited until the Sabbath was over. They waited until the sun set to come and be healed by Jesus. So in other words, however the Sabbath was being interpreted and practiced at the time that this gospel was written, the Sabbath had become an obstacle to that which was most life-giving, that people had to wait for it to pass.
Yes.
Rather than the means whereby which that which is life-giving can be given to humanity. And so again, there's all of this. There's so many layers to this week's chapter that we're looking at. It's one of the reasons I love the Synoptic Gospel so much. There's so much concrete material application here. Today we live in a global capitalist system where our economy is dependent upon it always growing and always producing. And I'm reminded of the book by Walter Brueggemann, The Sabbath as Resistance, where the Sabbath reminds us that we can't always be producing. That is unhealthy. That's imbalance. There has to be ebb and flow. There has to be time for rest and restoration, not just always doing and always producing and always getting at it. It's the
And I've
same.
heard.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
I've heard people talk about at different times about how important it is for, and it's talking to people who are middle and upper class, taking a Sabbath for their personal rest and restoration. That sometimes we can be workaholics, and and we need to have that balance. We need to have that spiritual retreat from the material world and reconnect our minds and our souls to the divine other who is transcendent and beyond us. And so we need the Sabbath to be kind of like this withdrawal from the material world so we can reconnect with the spiritual. And I don't have a problem with the concept of inviting anybody to take a day to 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 be connected more spiritually in what they understand their relationship with the mystical is. But that is not what the Sabbath was about. The Sabbath was about especially protecting the poor and
That's right.
protecting the marginalized and protecting the foreigner so that they would not be exploited and abused. And not just that that God required business people and slave owners and those type of people to give their people the day off. It also meant that they gave them a fair enough wage so that
Yes.
they could afford not to
Yes.
work a day.
The Sabbath
And
is
one,
a call to us to create a society where people don't have to work 7 days a week, three or
that's
four
right,
jobs, 7 days a week in
that's
order
right.
just to survive.
And we're ironically seeing that in our culture now because the anti-labor movement has been so successful
That's
that
right.
a lot of sectors of our economy do not have employee unions fighting for better wages, and so people are working for such low wages that they have to work second jobs, and we have a whole segment of our population putting in 50, 60, 70 hours a week to make enough to get by, which means they're not getting a Sabbath, not a holy separate into the metaphysical world Sabbath. They're just not getting any time to rest, period,
Correct.
because they're not getting paid a living wage. And
Correct.
the one of the things that is most sad to me is that on Labor Day, the day in September, for those of you watching in the United States, it's our day that we celebrate the labor movement and the rights that have been afforded to workers who who are employed by corporations. And the irony is that most of the people today who need a Labor Day holiday are working on Labor Day so that those of us in the middle and upper classes who are higher in the corporate echelon get our Labor Day. We don't really need a Labor Day vacation because we're guaranteed a certain number of vacation days throughout the year. But the the blue collar and the retail and the hospitality industry people who are making minimum wage or maybe barely a touch more than that
They
are
don't get Labor Day off.
they don't get Labor Day off, and that was supposed to be a day specifically. Even in symbolically, they should get that day off out of just saying, "Hey, we recognize the laborer for the work they do." But no, it's just another day off for those of us who are higher in the echelon.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, I mean, if we come back to that axis again, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but go back and read both the Sabbath commandment in Exodus and in Deuteronomy 5. The Sabbath commandment in the Torah was aimed at that social location that we today would call employers. It
Right.
wasn't it wasn't commanded to make the poor who have to work to survive feel guilty for not being able to take time off.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
was aimed at the employers saying, you cannot make people work unceasingly. This is not healthy. And
Yep.
and I'm thinking of oh, you just brought it up. You just said something that made me think of it, and now it's gone. Oh, maybe it'll come back to me. Maybe it'll come back. But again, um, the Sabbath commandment is not aimed at. Oh, that's what it was. That axis. that sometimes the most life-giving thing to do for certain people in certain economic locations
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
looks unlawful when it comes to things like
That's
the
right.
Sabbath. You know what I
That's
mean?
right.
If we're letting
Yes.
those two axes stand in tension, then the most life giving in this situation, just by necessity,
Yeah.
is they have to work to feed. I'm thinking of single mothers. I'm thinking about my mom, who was a single mother when I was
Mm-hmm.
growing up all those years. She couldn't afford to take a day off. I never
Right.
really knew my mother during those years. It wasn't until later that I really, till life changed for us, that things became different between us. But I mean, most 80s kids were already latchkey kids, anyways, because our
Mm-hmm.
parents were also absent. But I remember
Mm-hmm.
my mother, especially for economic reasons, was just not around because she was always working to try to support the two of us. And she didn't have a college education. She was a blue collar trade, type person. She was a beautician hairstylist that,
Mm-hmm.
was making minimum wage plus tips.
Yep.
And so again, for her, the most life-giving situation there would have been it by necessity, just by survival. If you're on the edge of surviving, then at that moment the most life-giving thing to do is whatever it takes to survive. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Of
Yep.
course, the most life-giving option would have been for her to have enough for her to be able to take some time off. That would have been even more
Mm-hmm.
life-giving, right? But that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't an option at that time. And so I'm
No.
just thinking of, even though it looks to the wealthy or the upper middle class like, oh, these, you're always violating the Sabbath. And I'm thinking of my Sabbatarian Christian friends that I know that I'm in relationship with. Um, it's important to hold that other axis of life giving versus death dealing in tension with the lawful versus unlawful. So
Yeah.
important.
And then I just think of this of so often how one of the criticisms of that is levied by wealthier people against people in poverty is, well, they just don't want to work. They don't want to. They're not willing to sacrifice enough to get ahead, and
Many of
and
them are
so
working their tails off.
the irony is that and so they try to sell the concept of the nobility of work, even though many of these people who are speaking from a position of privilege have 4 or more weeks of vacation a year plus all the holidays. um,
And they own
they
the businesses.
right.
That nobility of work. I mean, if we want to get into a socialist conversation, the exploitation of labor and who owns the means of production, the
Yeah,
nobility of work is basically motivate people to work because it's always going to financially benefit you way more than it's going to benefit them.
that's right. That's right. And
And the
so
Sabbath
there's
strikes at the heart of all that.
it does it just and that's why I've, as somebody who has seen the topic of Sabbath really misunderstood and warped to fit a very religious piety concept of what God demands from us. I can't say enough how important the principle of Sabbath as a scriptural concept from the Torah, from the prophets, and from Jesus is such a direct rebuke of the rich of those in systems, exploitative systems. The Sabbath is just so much to it that if you understand it, you cannot. If you are a person of conscience, and I will say, if you are a person who values the law, if you believe that God gave the Sabbath as law, then by golly, if you understand why God gave it as law, which was to protect the working class and the poor from exploitation, then by golly, you better start following it however you can, because it radically undermines the systems of the Hebrews times, of Jesus times, and of our time.
That's a great segue into the second section here in our reading this week, where Jesus goes into the synagogue. There's a man who has a hand that needs healed. And there's this tension now. They're watching him to see, is he going to heal on the Sabbath? Is he going to break the Sabbath? Which again was rooted in an interpretation of the Sabbath that was death dealing, that kept people oppressed rather than ushered them into liberation. And the whole second section of our reading this week is a reminder to us that no matter how religious or biblical or scholarly our interpretation of something might be, our practice within Christianity might be, if that practice, even if it's the Sabbath or something like that, if that practice is being used in a death dealing way, in an oppressive way, then it's time to reassess that interpretation and to move towards more life-giving interpretations. Jesus doesn't throw out the Sabbath here. Jesus was a good Jewish rabbi. You know what I mean? He doesn't throw out the Sabbath in the latter half. What he asks is it lawful to what did you say?
To do good or to do harm.
Yeah, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to, and he doesn't say not save life, he says to kill. It's that active voice here, to save life or to kill. If something were, and man, this is much larger now than the Sabbath. If any of our Christian practices are doing evil or doing harm or not saving life, but killing, and I think of women's rights, and I think of, bodily autonomy of women being taken away right now, and trans men and all of that. If something we're doing is killing rather than life-giving, it's death dealing rather than life-giving, it's time to reassess our interpretation of that practice, because again, the priority axis is the life-giving one, not whether it's biblical or lawful, or because you can interpret the Bible in life-giving and death-dealing ways. And the call here is, when we're doing it in a death-dealing way that keeps people oppressed and subjugated, it's time to reassess our understanding, our practice, our interpretation of those religious Christian things, and to embrace more life-giving interpretations of them. And
So
they
true.
were mad at him for doing this. I mean, they went out immediately afterwards and sought to kill him, because Jesus was calling to account even those within the synagogue system that had become complicit with the Roman Empire, and lifting up such things as these misinterpretations of Sabbath that kept people oppressed. If your Christianity is keeping people oppressed, then it's time to reassess your Christianity.
That's right. That's right. And there are some people, honestly, I know this to be true, that there are some people who can't be clear what I'm saying. I'm saying consciously, not conscientiously. I'm saying that in their conscious minds, they have committed themselves to a system of scriptural interpretation. They've committed themselves to a faith community, a denomination that interprets scriptures in certain ways, and they believe that, now I'm going to say this, they believe that they are being conscientious in obeying the law the way that it's being explained to them. And so consciously, they are not choosing to side with, they are not saying, I want to choose to support capitalism. I am choosing to support exploitation of workers.
They think they're just being lawful.
They just think they're being lawful to the scripture. And so if that causes tension with the material world in which we live, their call to people who are suffering under the exploitative system is to be faithful to the law and the scripture, and God will take care of you. This was the argument used during slavery. This was it's saying, you be faithful to your slave master, and do what the slave master says, and God will honor you with the afterlife. It's being said to LGBTQ people today. Deny who you are, closet yourself, hide who you truly are, don't love the people that you love, and God will bless you in the afterlife. Because these people are in their conscious mind believing they're being faithful to the scriptures, and what they don't understand, and because the wool's been pulled over their eyes, maybe not even by the whole denomination, maybe even the people at the head of the denomination are simply being devoted to a scriptural interpretation. Ultimately, what everyone has been duped into is are being used as an instrument of empire to exploit people, and you're teaching something that is a pie in the sky and the by and by theological framework that you may not even realize is harming people right now. And if you could only see the scriptures through the lens of the Hebrew prophet, through Jesus, through the Acts, through the justice lens, you would say, oh my goodness, not only do the scriptures speak to how to be faithful to God for a hereafter, it actually, even more than speaking about a hereafter, speaking about right now. And I've totally misread things, sincerely trying to do what I think is right and trying to explain why it's okay that sometimes good people suffer at the hands of an unjust system when I should have been fighting against the unjust system.
We're faithful to the x-axis, the horizontal axis, when we should have been faithful to the vertical axis. Now, to use the language we've been using in this conversation. See, this is why I love being back in the synoptics. There's so much good stuff here.
So good.
So much good stuff. So happy that the lectionary just took a hard left.
You used left specific intentionally. It's okay. I didn't miss that. All right. What else do you have, you leftist?
No, that's it. That's all I've got this week. I just love these stories. I love the use of the Sabbath in labor. I love the use of the Sabbath in justice. I love being called to interpret not just the Sabbath, but everything in our Jesus following by that the barometer of whether it's life-giving or not. All of that resonates just so deeply with me. It's healing for anyone who's experienced religious trauma where the only spectrum has been that horizontal axis. That vertical axis really does bring some healthy reconstruction and healing.
And and I love this too. I mean, we don't need to spend much time on this, but in other conversations, you and I have talked about how often, again, people in the position of privilege talk about the nobility of suffering and persecution, and saying these things that you are going through are temporary and transient, and they will pass, and then you'll move on to the eternal bliss of God. And here is Jesus coming in and just saying, I desire to give. You folks are so freaking tired. I want to give you rest. And this is what I'm called to do. This is part of my liberation, is to come to you, liberate you from the tyranny of work and exploitation, and give you rest. And that is worth a human being devoting his life and mission to, is to bring rest to oppressed and worn out people. And
I hear a sermon. I hear a sermon for universal basic income brewing right now.
Yeah. I mean, just this is revolutionary.
It is. It really is. All right. Well, to all of our supporters out there, thank you for supporting us. If you monetarily support the work of Renewed Heart Ministries, I want to thank you for that as well. If you'd like to join them in supporting Renewed Heart Ministries work, who sponsors this show, you can find Renewed Heart Ministries at renewedheartministries.com, and you can click on the donate button or just take advantage of all the free resources that's there. Todd, any closing words?
Nope.
All right.
We grateful to have you all, and we will look forward to being with you next week.
All right. Have a great week, everyone.